us. I'm Julie Rose, and I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Hiring is Testing, even if you're not calling it testing. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few pieces of information about the webinar. To avoid interruptions to the presentation, all attendees are in listen-only mode. You can still ask questions, and we encourage you to do so using the Q&A tab in the webinar dashboard. We will make every effort to address your questions at the end of the presentation as time allows. Today's presentation is available on the CPS HR Consulting website, and we'll also forward a link to all of today's attendees once the recording is available for viewing. Our presenters today are Jeff Burkoff, a senior consultant with CPS HR Consulting, and Hillary Ricardo, who is also a senior consultant with CPS HR Consulting. And now, without further ado, I'll turn the presentation over to Jeff and Hillary.
All right, thanks a lot. I'm Jeff. All right. So hiring is testing. Well, so what do we mean by this? Hiring is testing. Well, we hear a lot of HR practitioners say that they don't test or they don't use employment tests because they're not using what we traditionally think of as a test, like a multiple choice, written exam or a performance or skills test. But you are using some sort of process to select and hire people. And so whatever that process is, it actually qualifies as an employment test under professional and legal standards because you're using that process to make employment decisions. So obviously that has some really big implications. So we're going to talk about that, exactly what we mean by that, and the implications. But first of all, we want to know what tools you're using to hire personnel. So we have a poll.
Okay, here we go. So the poll is live. To start selecting your answers, please.
I'll just say MQ screening, we mean minimum qualifications screening. That also means your application review, resume review. T&Es, those are your training and experience questionnaires. Interviews, by that we mean any kind of interview, whether it's a selection interview, panel type interview, or hiring interviews. And of course, your standard multiple choice exams, and that could be paper-based or computer-based, and then any kind of performance test or work sample. So again, all that apply to you.
Okay, answers are coming in at a pretty good clip. We'll just give it just a few more seconds, see if there are any last few that need to respond. And just a couple more seconds. Okay, I think we've got all of our answers in now. Just wrap that up, and we'll share our results.
So Hillary, how do the results look?
Okay, so it looks like 95% of the group are saying that they're utilizing interviews. About 86% are using some sort of a minimum qualification screening. And then rounded out by the T&Es, 59% of folks are using those, as well as 58% using multiple choice exams, and then 60% using performance tests.
Okay, so all over the place, a lot of different kinds of tools being used. So a lot of MQ screening, obviously, T&Es, and that would include supplemental applications and things like that. So think about all of these. Now, you might not have considered all of these to be employment tests, but like I was saying before, because these tools are used to make employment decisions, they are considered by professional and legal standards to be tests, and therefore they must adhere to professional and legal standards. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that, what constitutes a test. We're also going to talk about some of the common selection tools. I think we're going to cover, certainly not all of them, but the most common selection tools, the ones that we see most often, and even some of the risks associated with them, particularly if they're developed and used incorrectly or relied on too heavily in a selection process. And then we're also going to talk about the legal and professional standards for selection tests. This shouldn't be new information, but it's a good reminder because then we're going to talk about, well, what can happen if our tests don't meet the legal and professional standards. And we're not suggesting at all that you don't use any of those types of selection tools or anything other than a traditional old-fashioned, say, multiple choice test. There are lots of good reasons for using all of these different types of selection tools, including short on resources, time, money. You have large candidate counts that you need to reduce. So really good reasons for using these. But we're going to talk about how to ensure that these tests, if you do use them, adhere to professional standards and laws. And then we're also going to provide some recommendations for using these common selection tools or tests so that they're more valid, more fair, and more defensible. So this concept that any procedure used to make an employment decision is a test is, it's not new, it's not cutting edge, it's actually seen throughout the professional and legal standards for employment selection. I would say most notably, it's the official policy of the EEOC, which, as you know, is the primary enforcement agency for employment law. It's also written right into the Uniform Guidelines on Employee Selection Procedures, which, as you know, provide guidance to employers in complying with civil rights laws. And, of course, Uniform Guidelines are used by enforcement agencies and as well as courts when reviewing hiring practices. The U.S. Department of Labor provides some additional information regarding what is considered a test, and they state that tests include not just your traditional knowledge and ability tests, but also, they say, it inventories subjective procedures and projective instruments. So I find this really interesting. So the fact that even subjective procedures can be tests means that the definition of a test isn't based on the characteristics of the measure itself, but rather, like even its objectivity, or its validity or reliability, but rather on its use. The fact that it's made, that it's used to make employment decisions, however that's done. And then here in California, we happen to have in our law states that a test or examination includes any investigation of character, personality, or education and experience. So education experience, that means that your minimum qualification screen is also a test. So, all right, so I think we would look at some of these more common ones. So we're going to go through some of these. So we're just going to go through some of what are the kind of, I'd say, the most common of these selection processes that we see.
Right. So one of the most common tools, as Jeff mentioned, are used in organizations for almost any type of job vacancy. So this is minimum qualification screening. It's sometimes referred to as a resume screening or resume review, which, of course, most of us are familiar with, and consists of an applicant submitting a resume or completing an employment application for a job opening, and then an applicant's listed previous education and experience is compared to the listed requirements of the job. The requirements of the job can come from input provided by hiring managers, human resources, or the class specifications, sometimes referred to as class standards, and then the MQs that are identified to be eligible for the job. Sometimes this review is conducted by a human being or by a computer in an applicant tracking system. This type of review can also extend to a review of the applicant's social media footprint as a part of this process as well. So the benefits of this type of selection tool are that they're quick, they're relatively easy process, they don't require significant resources to develop and administer, and it's a way in which an applicant can show interest in a given job vacancy, and it assumes that someone's background and experience, if it relates to the job, will predict job success. Unfortunately, there are some pitfalls that are often unexpected. So one is common for class specifications and their included MQs to be based on outdated or incorrect information. As a result, if applicants' resumes are being assessed upon those MQs that aren't accurate, potentially qualified candidates can be screened out. Another pitfall are that resumes and application reviews can cause what is referred to as disparate impact. That is unintentional discrimination. Disparate impact occurs when policies or practices or other systems that appear to be neutral result in a disproportionate impact on a protected group. So an example of this is requiring a degree as a part of your minimum qualification, but with no real basis or rationale for that requirement. So this can unintentionally result in this example in socioeconomic discrimination. Another pitfall is what is referred to as unintentional bias. This can occur when an application is reviewed and a decision is made based on factors assumed about that applicant. So an example of this is based upon a name on the application. There can be an assumed nationality or gender of that applicant, and the reviewer can make a decision and that's unconsciously biased. Of course, if resumes are screened by a computer, this isn't going to occur, but a pitfall with computer screening and applicant tracking systems are if keywords are inadvertently not included on an otherwise qualified applicant's resume, the computer screen may screen out qualified candidates. So lastly, in cases where the MQs are minimal, or in cases where many applications are received, this type of selection process, it very rarely reduces the number of applications, at least significantly, and it really does little to help differentiate between candidates. Another very common and trend of the type of selection tool that's often used is training and experience evaluation. It's sometimes referred to as a TME, sometimes referred to as a supplemental application. So there are variations of this type of tool. They're often broken down into two main types. That is what's called the point-based TME or the narrative-based TME. The narrative-based TME is sometimes used as an addition to an applicant's submitted resume or application. It asks a handful or less of pointed job-related questions in which the applicant writes a response. It's usually related to their background or expertise in a particularly given area, and usually within an instructed limited space. So these responses are reviewed sometimes by hiring managers, sometimes by human resources, to identify the types of expertise, and it expands a bit more than what would be included on a typical application or a resume. A well-developed narrative-based TME is rated against predetermined job-related criteria. This type of tool has statistically strong predictive validity. It's highly recommended. Nevertheless, what is most commonly utilized is this point-based TME. So this is often a list of task statements or knowledge or skill or ability statements in which applicants are asked to rate themselves on. So it's either based on how much experience they have with a particular task or how much knowledge they have on a given topic. Sometimes applicants are asked to provide the number of years of experience or the number of years of training that they've had on a specific task. These types of exams are very easy to develop. They don't have to be kept confidential. They can be placed online for anyone to take at any time. So as a result, they're a really popular tool to use. Sometimes these types of tests can be of value. So particularly for jobs that already require very specific or extensive kinds of entry requirements in their MQs. So jobs that require a certain kind of degree, or they require a certification or a license that an applicant has to possess in order to be qualified for the jobs. Those kinds of jobs lend themselves well to these point-based TMEs. But for most jobs, not necessarily. So when applicants are simply asked to rate themselves on these types of tools, extensive research shows that they have very little predictability. So that is, these types of tools are not able to identify or distinguish successful candidates, nor predict who will perform well on a job. So distortions of applicant answers to these TME self-rating questions can result in those either intentionally self-inflating their ratings, or candidates simply are unable to accurately rate themselves on their actual abilities. These folks will end up at the bottom of your list, and those who are maybe not being as accurate or not able to be accurate end up at the top of your eligible list. So what does this mean? Ultimately, This also means that it doesn't distinguish very much between candidates. Most often in these kinds of exams, most candidates pass. So this ends up defeating the ultimate purpose of your selection tool and who is best fit to select as a qualified candidate for a vacancy. Nevertheless, we do understand, and it's important to point out, that sometimes this is the only tool organizations have that will work for them. So either because the kinds of specialty vacancies that they want to fill, or just due to limited resources. Given that there are methodologies to employ that, while not eliminating all of the pitfalls mentioned, they can at least abate them and improve upon this type of tool. So examples of this can include inserting verification requirements based upon candidates' self-ratings, or including more verifiable types of questions in the tool itself to at least help reduce some of that tendency for candidate inflation. So the last tool that's commonly used that we want to discuss is often not fully considered a test, and that's the interview. The interview is one of the commonly used processes to select individuals to hire, to promote into job vacancies. It can be a very highly structured process that's sometimes referred to as a structured interview, or sometimes referred to as a QAP, a Qualifications Appraisal Panel. It's often used to identify qualified candidates to be placed on an eligible list. It can also be used at the actual hiring process, which is typically less structured. It's often conducted by a hiring manager, and this is sometimes referred to as the hiring interview. In most cases, the interview allows the interviewer to ask a set of questions assessing a candidate's experience or job knowledge related to the job. Occasionally, interviews are developed to assess various domains or competencies that the hiring manager or human resources determined to be important to successful performance on the job. Interviews can be conducted in person, but they can also be conducted via video, teleconferencing, or phone. So as well developed, interviews can be a very good predictive tool in identifying qualified candidates for a job. It's pertinent that interview questions are developed based upon job-related criteria. They need to include questions that elicit responses that give the candidate an opportunity to provide well-thought-out responses, and that the interview process is structured so that the same questions are given to all candidates in the same order. So this latter criteria allows for the standardization of the process so that all candidates are treated equally. Ultimately, candidate responses should be rated against predetermined rating criteria, either per question or per domain or competency, depending on how you develop the interview, to ensure that candidates are being assessed on what's job-related and expected upon entry to the job, using the same criteria in a fair and a consistent manner. One of those common pitfalls is this lack of standardization. It's often resulting from the misconception that the interview isn't necessarily a test. So this lack of standardization not only can potentially miss the opportunity to assess the candidates against the requirements of the job, but it can also create situations in which candidates may perceive the process as unfair and even potentially discriminatory. So, for instance, using different questions for candidates, this can result in some candidates even unintentionally receiving more difficult questions compared to others. And while not having a standard set of predetermined questions and expected responses, it can possibly and very likely unintentionally lead to discrimination. So this includes off-the-cuff questions, such as what part of town a person lives in, or asking if they have kids, or how they will get to work, or other family-type situations, either during the actual interview or even before or after the official interview process. All of this can result in discrimination, whether it's intentional or not. Lastly, another pitfall that can occur in any kind of an interview is unintentional bias, which we had previously discussed, but particularly for an interview. There are many forms of bias that occur by interviewers in the interview process, even despite good intentions. So biases, such as an example of something called the halo effect. This occurs when the interviewer is so impressed off the bat for whatever reason about a candidate that all of the responses the candidate gives subsequently are rated high. So regardless of how the candidate responds to any of the subsequent questions. Another common example of an interview bias that occurs is called the similar to me effect. This is the tendency for the interviewer to compare a candidate's responses to how he or she would actually respond to a question. It can also, the interviewer can perceive certain characteristics of the candidate that reminds the interviewer of him or herself. And the danger to this, of course, is not really listening to the candidate's responses and what they're actually saying and rating them on their actual abilities and responses. Nevertheless, being aware that these types of biases exist and being aware that the interview is an actual test that needs to be created with structure and standardization and rated against job-related criteria can all help alleviate these potential pitfalls.
So we saw from our poll that you all are using lots of these different kinds of processes, and then I'm sure we could come up with another long list of other procedures that are being used. So why are they so commonly used? Obviously there are some very good reasons for using these. Hillary talked about a lot of those really good reasons for using them. And the first thing that comes to mind for me is, you've got to have some kind of an initial screening to get to reduce very large applicant pool into a manageable group of candidates, and then later in the process, you might need to reduce, a large group of candidates into a manageable group of candidates. So, I don't want to say that these that kind of testing, staff or money and time, and you might not even have the staff expertise in-house to do that kind of testing. You also might not have a choice. Sometimes testing procedures are, they're mandated by civil service rules or written into the MOUs or in department policies, so you might not have a choice. But also, sometimes we see that some of these methods are used just because there's a belief among the exam analysts or the HR folks that there really is nothing to test. We might have a very entry-level job and say the minimum qualification is, a year of general clerical experience and everything else they're going to learn on the job. So there's really not much to test. We would argue, however, that unless they're going to learn everything on the job, in other words, unless you're going to teach them everything, and that means reading and writing and basic communication and following directions, unless you're going to teach them all of that, there is something to test. There is always something to test. So never assume that. But thinking again about these challenges that might lead an organization to using one of these shorter methods, we'd like to know actually what challenges you've experienced. And so we've got a poll now. We want to do another poll just like we did before. So think about the challenges that you've experienced in terms of, say, lack of time, expertise, lack of internal staff or money, or even organizational support. So you don't have, say, management buy-in to do some other kind of a testing process.
Okay, so the poll is launched. We're getting some answers in. You can select all of the answers that apply to your situation. It's not a single answer question, and
select all that apply for sure, because they probably always do apply at one time or another.
People are really responding very quickly on this one. Okay, we'll give it about another 10 seconds, so be sure and get your answers in, and then we can share the results. Okay, and just a couple more seconds.
Well, this question usually hits home with people because I think just about everyone experiences some of these challenges at one time or another.
Wow,
so
as quickly as the answers are coming in, I would say it really did resonate.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's take a look at the results.
Hillary, how's it look?
Okay, so 80% of you are saying time. Time is definitely a challenge. And then staff. And staffing is a challenge. And then followed by resources such as money. And expertise, staff expertise, and then 45% are saying organizational support. So Basically all of it.
So all of the above, kind of, yeah, yeah, I think we've all experienced all of these. And again, we don't want to imply that all of these methods are bad necessarily. They certainly have their place, and sometimes it's the best way to go. I guess our point is don't automatically just rely on these. So I want to talk about, we've been talking a lot about the legal and professional standards, and we may be violating legal and professional standards if we're using some of these. So I want to talk about that a little bit. So remember that any procedure used to make an employment-related decision is an assessment procedure or a test, and therefore it's subject to professional and legal standards. So the important point here really is that just because it doesn't look like a test doesn't mean that it's exempt from proper testing practices. Okay, so what are these proper testing practices that we're talking about? Well, first of all, according to the law, first and foremost, you can't discriminate, right? And so we have lots of good civil rights laws prohibiting discrimination. You're familiar with Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, prohibiting employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. And our protected groups have been expanded with amendments to that. ADA, of course, prohibits employment discrimination against us really old people over 40. ADA, as you know, prohibits discrimination against people with disabilities in employment, but also in other areas, public services, public accommodations, even telecommunications. And then additional laws and regulations, particularly at the state and local level, have added to the protected groups, and now they include all sorts of groups based on pregnancy, marital status, veteran status, sexual orientation, even in some places now gender expression and transgender status. So the civil rights laws say that you have to have a selection process that doesn't discriminate against protected groups. And if your process does have a disparate impact, then you need to show the job relatedness of your procedures. So in other words, you need to show that you are selecting for qualifications that are truly needed to perform the job. Now, civil rights laws apply to everyone, but if you work in the public sector, you also operate under merit principles. And the merit principles were originally established to ensure fair treatment in employment in the federal sector, but they've really been adopted by most state and local civil service systems. The first merit principle states that a selection process must be open and competitive and based on the KSAs, the knowledge, skills, and abilities needed to perform the job. So this means that now, and this is kind of a gross generalization, but in a way it kind of means that the private sector can do almost whatever they want in selection as long as there's no discrimination, no disparate treatment. And then if it turns out there is disparate impact or adverse impact, then they have to defend the process by demonstrating its validity or demonstrating its job relatedness. But in the public sector, because of our merit principles, we have to design our selection processes up front so that they are absolutely assessing only the KSAs needed for job performance. So how do we do that? Well, in the 1970s, after some landmark Supreme Court cases, it was really clear that many employers still didn't know how to develop and implement non-discriminatory hiring practices. So the EEOC, the Civil Service Commission, which is now Office of Personnel Management, Department of Labor, and Department of Justice developed the Uniform Guidelines on Employee Selection Procedures in order to assist employers in complying with the civil rights laws in their selection procedures. And although the guidelines they're technically not law, they are written into the U.S. Code of Regulations, but they're technically not the law. But because they're applied by enforcement agencies, civil service commissions, and of course courts in the enforcement of the laws, they really do carry the weight of the law. So they're very, very important. They're also very important to us because they specify exactly what an employer has to do to ensure that their selection procedures are job related. That is, that we are assessing only the qualities needed for performing the job. So only those knowledge, skills, and abilities that are needed for the job at hire or at promotion. So we may not be meeting these requirements if, for example, we're assessing minimum qualifications above the level needed for the job, for example, or assessing KSAs that can be learned on the job over time. And so what happens if we do that? There are obviously a lot of things that can go wrong. What happens? Well, we might be hiring the wrong people. So if people aren't qualified, they're going to be leaving the organization. We have to select new people. That costs the organization a lot of time and money. If people are placed in jobs they're not qualified for, one way or another, they're going to be leaving the organization, whether they're escorted out or whether they select out themselves. So this constant high turnover certainly gets in the way of an organization doing their work. But even if people don't leave, even if it doesn't result in high turnover, you've got poor job fit. So, you don't have the right person in the right jobs, and so you're going to have lower performance, lower job satisfaction, lower engagement. They might not work well with others on the team, all sorts of things. And then, of course, you might be violating civil rights laws and regulations, or merit rules, or civil service rules. I mentioned Supreme Court cases, of course. I just want to remind you about the Briggs v. Duke Power 1971, which was the landmark Supreme Court case that kind of started us on the road to proper selection practices. Just very briefly, just as a reminder, so Duke Power had a power plant in rural Georgia in the late 60s. They were hiring maintenance workers for their power plant. And as a minimum qualification, they were requiring a high school diploma, or if people didn't have a high school diploma, they could pass an aptitude test. And scores on, a certain score on an aptitude test would be considered equivalent to a high school diploma. Long story short, there was adverse impact. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court asked the defendants, well, how do you know that this particular score on this particular test would predict job performance? And of course, they weren't able to answer that because they hadn't studied the job. In fact, the Supreme Court then, in their response, they said the first thing that you should have done was analyze the job. You should have analyzed the job to identify the important work behaviors and then identify the qualities that people have to perform those behaviors. Then you can test for them. So that was obviously a very landmark case for us, but then there are many cases that unfortunately we don't have time to go into. I'll mention, though, a fairly recent one, 2015, though I don't think the final ruling has come out. Smith et al. The City of Boston. This is where a group of minority Boston police sergeants, they alleged that their promotional multiple choice exams were biased against minority candidates, and also that the city failed to measure certain other job-related skills. It's really interesting because what the court found, and it wasn't so much that there was a problem with that multiple choice test necessarily, but the court found that the city failed to demonstrate that the promotional process would predict job performance because they didn't have an exam plan that showed how the job analysis results, which identified the critical KSAs needed for the job, translated to a whole assessment process that would assess all of those KSAs effectively and thoroughly. So, Hillary, tell us, what do we do? What do we help about?
Yes. So there are a number of ways to ensure that your selection tools that you utilize not only meet professional standards and laws and best practice, but it also can aid in identifying the most qualified candidates for your organization or agency. The first and one of the most important ways to ensure that your job you're recruiting or hiring for is sound is to ensure that the tool or tools you use are job related. So that is that the tool measures what is important and needed at entry into the job. The primary and most sound way to do this is to conduct a job analysis for the targeted job, which allows for the identification of the job tasks and the knowledge, skills, and abilities that a candidate must possess coming into the job and that are necessary to complete those tasks. So all selection tools must be able to be linked back to those knowledge, skills, and abilities. All selection tools must also be considered reliable and valid. So in terms of the concept of reliability, this refers to the degree to which a selection tool produces stable and consistent results over time. In terms of the concept of validity, this is the degree to which a selection tool measures what it's claiming to measure. So while there are different types of validity evidence, the most common in testing and selection is related to this concept of content validity. And this type of validity evidence comes from conducting a job analysis in which a direct relationship can be shown between what's required of the job and what the selection tool is measuring. So that is the knowledge, skills, or abilities that have been identified for candidates to possess upon entry to that job vacancy. So this gives the selection tool developer content validity. So a requirement of a job analysis. So what is a job analysis? A job analysis is the systematic and structured process of gathering information about a particular job necessary to make informed decisions and develop defensible processes for selection and promotion. So there are several methods and ways in which to go about conducting a job analysis, so long as certain criteria in the process is met according to the uniform guidelines and employee selection procedures, which Jeff had just previously discussed, which was created by the EEOC and the Civil Service Commission, Department of Labor, and Department of Justice. So in this next slide, we'll talk a bit more in detail about these basic steps related to a job analysis. So the basic steps of a job analysis are as outlined within the slide. What's important to realize is the job analysis can be a labor-intensive, very detailed study of a job that adheres to all of these steps. However, it doesn't mean that a job analysis has to be lengthy and complex. Well, certainly there are some complex jobs or jobs that have numerous units or specialties or vary based on assignments and location. What they may require a great number of resources, certainly not all do. It is possible to conduct a job analysis process that's a little bit more truncated or doesn't require significant resources, and this varies, of course, between different kinds of job types and also the resources available to an organization. Nevertheless, at a minimum, these steps outlined in the slide really must be met. So first and foremost, in some way, a literature review needs to be conducted. A literature review really can just be a process of collecting information. So whether that's from a class specification, previous studies, duty statements that HR has created, but it's gathering information about a job. What also really does need to occur is involving subject matter experts or SMEs. And these are individuals who are knowledgeable of the job under study, typically incumbents on the job, first-level supervisors, sometimes managers. This can be conducted by something more formal, like a job observation or a job audit, or a more formal interview of the SME. But it can also just be a matter of an informal interview and talking to those SMEs about what the job entails. In some manner, task and knowledge, skill, and ability statements need to be drafted. And that's utilizing input from the SMEs in terms of the content of what those statements are saying about the job under study. In some manner, some sort of rating methodology needs to be decided. This can be anywhere along the spectrum of something informal, like a focus group of subject matter experts and using a consensus methodology of collecting ratings, or what's often typical is a job analysis questionnaire sent out to all incumbents and first-level supervisors. What's being collected are ratings on each of these task statements and knowledge, skill, and ability statements. And we're looking for our tasks performed on the job, and if so, how frequently, and are they important? And for the knowledge, skills, and abilities, are those important to the job? When do you need to possess them? Upon entry to the job? Or is it going to be a knowledge or a skill that you're going to learn later once you're already hired? When you collect that information, you're going to look at some sort of the results in some sort of manner. You're going to look at the relationship between the tasks and KSAs. What knowledge or skill or ability do you need to perform which of the tasks of the job? And then finally, some sort of documentation needs to happen. It can be in a form of a technical report, or it can be a matter of simply documentation that's not necessarily in a full report, but documenting the steps that you conducted to conduct your study. So this would typically be the last step in the process. So once the requirements of the job are identified and the knowledge, skills, and abilities are identified, then the selection tool or tools used to measure those knowledge, skills, and abilities must also be identified. So unfortunately, this selection planning process, sometimes referred to as the exam or examination planning process, as it's often referred to, is often the step that is most often missed or overlooked. So it's imperative to take the results of your job analysis and consider these results with how they fit into your overall selection plan. Even if your plan is using a simple resume screen or a simple TE, this still needs to occur. So this was the exact step that the city of Boston, that Jeff mentioned, discussed in a previous slide. This is what they failed to address in a 2015 case in which the court specifically cited as being problematic. So that is that the city failed to show the relationship between the results of the study of your job and then any thoughtful methodology in determining how candidates are going to be assessed. So in other words, they failed to create an exam plan or a selection plan, using those synonymously, based upon the requirements of the job. But creating an exam plan can actually be very simple, and it starts by either human resources or some sort of testing professional reviewing the results of the job analysis and then asking themselves a series of questions. So, for instance, what exam types make the most sense given our KSAs from the job analytics study? What KSAs that were determined to be important to the job and needed an entry to the job? Which KSAs best measure a certain selection tool? So this is really a logical determination on what exam types make the most sense to use. It can also be done by gathering a panel of subject matter experts to help assist and provide some feedback and input in this process. So an example of this is you're looking at your KSAs and you have some mathematical knowledge that's required. This may lend itself to some sort of test in which candidates can be tested in math. So maybe you have multiple choice exams. Or for another example, if you have a number of physical ability type statements from your job analysis that are considered critical and expected on the job, perhaps there's a need for a performance test, and so on. So in a subsequent slide, we'll show you an example of an easy way to go about doing this exercise. Another question to ask is, what resources do you have as an organization available to you? So take into account, of course, the time, the expertise, what facilities are available. This will help to shape what's really doable and realistic in creating your exam plan. Also ask yourself, how many applicants do we expect or who typically apply for a given type of job vacancy? Because this certainly may impact the type of tools that should be used. So an example of this, if you typically have or expect a very high number of applications for a given vacancy, you might want to consider, in addition to an application or resume, consider using something such as the narrative-based supplemental exam, or what we previously referred to as the narrative-based training and experience exam, to help reduce the number of candidates up front in a job-related manner and make that group more manageable to do further testing to find who is most qualified for the job. So once these questions are answered and the type or types of selection tools are identified, it's at that point that an organization needs to determine the weighting of each exam tool used in your overall selection process. So that is, what percentage should be given to each selection tool to determine candidates' final scores in the overall selection process. So examples of what I'm meaning around this are, you, for example, can have an exam plan consisting maybe of a resume screen, for instance, that's pass-fail, and then you have an interview. In that interview, those scores are going to be 100% of those candidate scores. Or another example, you can have a multiple choice test that's weighted 60%, and then interview that's weighted 40% of your candidate scores. So how do you determine this and still adhere, of course, to professional standards and laws? So there are multiple ways about getting at this. So for example, you can use subject matter expert input, and you can map or link the KSAs from your job analysis results to various types of exam tools that make the most logical sense to use just that. And then you can make some mathematical calculations based upon the number of KSAs that map or link to each tool. And this can help determine your exam tools in a job-related manner. Another way, you can also use your KSA importance ratings from your job analysis and your mathematical determinations. Really, the most critical point that we're wanting to make is that you need to make a rational, thoughtful, job-related determination on this part of the process that can ultimately be justified and documented. The next slide is an example of how, an exercise of how this process can be started. So this slide shows an example of what we refer to as a selection options matrix. This is an exercise that we recommend, which we find useful to help guide the exam planning process. It can be completed either by an HR professional or with the help of subject matter experts. But the idea around this type of process is to take each of the important and needed at entry KSAs from your job analysis, as depicted here in your left-hand column, and link or map them to the most appropriate methods logically of testing to each of the exam tools and types listed in the column headings. So this is just an exercise that helps determine a type or types of testing tools that make the most sense to use, and then of course also considering your other business factors to take into account, such as your number of expected applications and the resources available as previously discussed. But this exercise can be helpful in beginning to determine your selection tool weightings based upon the number of linkages or mappings under each selection tool heading. And reviewing the relative, another method is also looking at those important ratings from your job analysis results to also use into your mathematical computations to help you weight your exam tools in your selection plan. And again, really what it comes down to is putting thought into the exam types into your selection process and really relating it to the requirements of the job.
Okay, so you've done all that process and you've determined that some of these common selection tools are appropriate for your process. I just want to give you some recommendations because remember, these may be appropriate, but you can always make them better, right? We can always improve anything. So these are just some general recommendations. So for our minimum qualification screen and our application and resume reviews, first of all, more experience is not necessarily better, right? So don't just give points for more experience, no matter how much experience that is. In fact, there's some research that suggests that for most jobs, after about 5 years of experience, experience doesn't predict job performance any better. So whatever your required years of experience, and also the types of experience, and this goes for education as well, it should be based on your job analysis results, of course, and also determined with the help of subject matter experts. And you want to make sure that anyone reviewing applications and minimal qualifications is aware of the possibility of unintentional bias and how to eliminate it. And also, if you're using some sort of an automated system to screen applications or resumes, which is becoming more and more popular now, make sure you work with subject matter experts to identify the key phrases and the key words that you put into the system. So remember, T&E evaluations, training and experience evaluations, remember these are really best for very specific job skills that require someone to have kind of unique or rare expertise or very specific degrees or licenses or certifications or so on. Think of Think of this if a yes or no question could tell you a whole lot about whether a candidate is qualified to perform a job. Do you have this particular license or this certification or this specialized degree? That's best for a T&E evaluation. And remember, avoid point-based self-ratings if at all possible, but at a minimum, any kind of self-rating process you use, you want to have some kind of method to reduce lying or response distortion. Like have applicants provide a reference who could verify their information, even if you don't actually follow up on the references. I know some organizations do routinely, some generally don't, and some it's a matter of time and resources, but either way, you want to notify the applicants or candidates that you may do that. And of course, a better option is always a narrative supplemental application, which would be scored using an objective criteria like behaviorally anchored rating scales. Always much better. But whatever your rating criteria are, they should always be based on the task and KSAs from your job analysis, always. And of course, always use subject matter expert input. And then finally, for interviews, again, these should always be based on your job analysis results and developed with SME input. So make sure that the questions are fully job related and that the process is structured. And this applies to selection interviews like oral exams and appraisal panels, but also to hiring interviews. So you never stray from job relatedness. Scoring should always be objective, preferably using some kind of behaviorally anchored rating scales. And you also want to make sure that all interviewers, all the panel members or raters are trained in conducting and scoring the interview, and especially how to keep the process standardized and make sure that you treat all candidates fairly and eliminate bias. So we're going to start to wrap it up here. This is just, in conclusion, remember, any tool that's used to make an employment decision is considered a test. So just because it doesn't look like a test doesn't mean that it's exempt from proper testing procedures. So this includes all of those common selection tools we've been talking about and more, including your NQ screenings, your T&Es, and even the hiring interviews, remember, and anything else that you can think of where you're making an employment decision. You want to make sure that you consider all of your options. So Hillary talked about coming up with your selection options matrix, and your exam plan should be based on the relative importance of all of the KSAs and all of that. Make sure that whatever tool you're using it for a specific purpose and when it's warranted. Like, for example, if you need to reduce candidate counts, you can use one of these tools. But don't rely on any one of these tools. It's really best to use multiple assessment procedures and kind of more of a holistic approach to selection. And just remember that all of these tools can be developed better to be more effective, fair, and defensible. And of course, you can achieve this by conducting a job analysis and developing an exam plan that's based on your job analysis results, always using subject matter experts. And just remember to choose the most appropriate testing method based on the KSAs. So that is our conclusion. Right now, we have a little bit of time left to open it up to questions.
Terrific. Thank you. We do have some questions that have come in, so let's jump right into that. The first one asks, during panel interviews, what's the best method for soliciting information from an interviewee when their answers are brief?
In answer to that, I think one of the first things that you need to make sure that is happening is that in the development of those questions, that they are developed so that they are very broad and open-ended, that they ask for specific types of examples. You can even, in your question development, include some follow-up questions as a part of the standardized question that is given to everyone. So certainly you want to be able to do that. And then in that manner, you can be sure that if a candidate is giving a brief response, it's not due to how the question is developed or given. That it really may simply be because the candidate wasn't prepared or didn't have a thoroughly thought out response. You can certainly also, so long as you treat all candidates in the same way, you could make sure, but you follow up with some questions such as, is that your complete response? Is there anything more that you would like to say to make sure that they understand and that you're all on the same page, that the candidate is finished with their response?
Yeah, so when you just remember, any follow-up questions you ask, you have to ask them of all the candidates. So it's okay to have a follow-up question just to make sure you get the right detail, but have that scripted out, ask all the candidates. And otherwise, like Hillary said, just make sure that it's in the question itself. It kind of indicates all of the information they're supposed to provide to you.
Good information. Okay, so the next question is, how involved should those with expertise, such as exam analysts, be with assisting hiring managers in developing selection instruments?
This is really interesting because what we see a lot of times in a lot of organizations is the hiring managers they sort of have the responsibility for creating the selection process, and HR or exam analysts are involved to varying degrees. And we would argue that that's sort of the opposite approach, where the exam development really needs to be driven by the exam analysts and HR with the help of the hiring managers. Because the problem is, you can imagine, and you've probably seen it, hiring managers can just, come up with whatever questions they want, and they can select people based on, who they just want in the job, and it's not necessarily going to be a job-related exam, so you might not be getting the best people for the job, and of course, you might be discriminating against people.
And then with that said, we are aware that there are some organizations where there's just not resources available, so the hiring managers are the ones who are developing these assessment tools. In those instances, what we would say is absolutely make sure, at a minimum, that you're providing ongoing training to those hiring managers in terms of how to develop and how to administer those tools. I'd also recommend making sure that you review any kind of exam, even the interview questions that the hiring managers develop, to make sure that they are standardized and fair and meet applicable best practices.
I would also make sure that the hiring managers have a copy of the job analysis results, and you instruct them, as you're developing your exam content, make sure you are actually assessing these particular KSAs, and that way you can make sure that it's job related.
Okay, terrific. One more question here is from someone who says they see a lot of counties using SME screening to rank candidates in lieu of written or oral tests. So what are ways to reduce bias?
This is an interesting question, and we've seen this, that this is something that's happening. What I would say is kind of reiterating what we've kind of our theme of our presentation here, is that it still needs to be based upon job-related criteria. So if you're using SME screening to rate candidates, it really needs to be against some sort of bars or behavioral anchors, rating scales, that are developed based upon the requirements of the job, and that you are using this process, this ranking process, in a standardized manner that goes back to the job requirements. In terms of reducing bias, this is a difficult one in terms of some of the pitfalls that we mentioned in the presentation. Certainly don't want any unintentional bias to come into play. So what I would recommend is, if at all possible, redact the names. Redact any qualifying information that could lead to potential bias, so that you really are looking at expertise and training related to that criteria that you develop.
Yeah, so I'd say the two things. So they're rating them blindly, so they can't judge based on any kind of personally identifiable information. But also, it's just like with the hiring managers who are developing selection. These SMEs are basically coming up with their own selection process. It's just sort of in their mind. They're imagining who they think the ideal candidate is. Make sure they understand what the job requirements are, again, based on your job analysis, and just instruct them to try to identify the information in the resumes or the applications that's really getting at those particular KFAs.
Okay, well that puts us right at the top of the hour. So I want to thank you, Jess and Hillary, for a great presentation, and thank you to everyone who joined us today. We will send an email with a link to the recording and to the slide deck, which you can download. Have a good day. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.